Welcome to FDA Imports, cross-border compliance with attorney Benjamin L. England.
Hi, and welcome to FDA Imports, cross-border compliance with Benjamin England. I'm Kendall Trusky, your host. Hi, Benjamin. How are you today?
Great, thanks. How are you? It's great to see you. Happy to be able to come and talk a little bit about FDA and customs issues.
We're looking forward to learning all about it. To start, could you tell us a little bit about your background practicing law at the intersection of the FDA and custom laws?
Sure. I started at the FDA quite a number of years ago. My background was actually in microbiology. I was a microbiologist for the FDA. And after that was in import and domestic compliance and investigations. Over a period of time, I found myself in Miami working in enforcement with FDA and with customs. Went to law school while I was in Miami and was planning to leave the government. I came back to headquarters in the DC area, and after that, maybe 2 or 3 years in headquarters, decided to go out and practice law. And I found myself with a lot of experience, obviously in the Food and Drug Administration, having worked for the FDA, but also in the customs and trade space. And so I established essentially a law practice and a consulting practice right at the intersection of those two agencies. It's been 20 years in the business and have had a great time working with a lot of clients in a lot of different FDA regulated sectors.
Very interesting. Well, you've built a reputation for navigating the complex relationship between FDA regulations and custom laws. So can you explain how these two areas intersect and why it's important for businesses to understand both?
Yes, certainly. There are not many things that FDA regulates that don't cross the border at some point, whether inbound or exports. And whenever you cross the border, you're going to be subject to customs rules. And many companies that are in the import space might have a good understanding of what the customs requirements but they may not know the Food and Drug or USDA or EPA or other agency requirements. And the vice versa also is true. A lot of food companies, medical device companies, pharmaceutical companies understand what FDA might expect in their regulatory construct. But when you cross the border, you're suddenly sort of in another land. Right? You're using words and language, and there's enforcement tools that the government has that are different. The interaction is different with the government. And quite frankly, the risks are different when you're importing products. So the intersection of the two agencies right there at the border during the importation process can be very, very confusing for companies that otherwise feel sort of comfortable with their regulatory environment.
That's understandable. Let me ask you this. From your experience, what are some of the most common mistakes businesses make when trying to comply with FDA regulations for imported products?
The most common mistakes probably have more to do with not really spending enough time understanding what the government is going to ask you when you're importing product. And you have to think of it this way, right? The government, their job is to evaluate imported products for admissibility. And the information that they receive is going to come through a customs broker. It's going to be electronic transactions, electronic transmission of data that's screened by the customs and FDA systems. And the screening of that data is going to occasionally cause a need for an examination or a sampling or at least some inquiry. And most of the time, importers, if they've never done it before, they know their underlying substantive FDA compliance system, but they don't know the kinds of things that FDA is going to ask for. And so that's where companies they'll get into a dialogue with the agency and they get into it too far before they realize that they've said something that just now has the FDA inspecting everything.
I can see that happening. Very complex. Well, you've worked with clients across a range of industries, from food and beverage to pharmaceuticals to medical devices. Are there any particular industries or types of goods that face more significant hurdles at the intersection of the FDA and the customs law?
Yes, certainly. It comes down with the FDA from the FDA side in terms of risk. Products that represent the greatest amount of risk are going to also be regulated with the highest level of stringency, right? So food products are going to be, and cosmetic products ordinarily are going to be considered to be lower risk products, but they're not zero risk. I mean, food safety is a major issue. Cosmetics that are used around the eye, for instance, could be, present certain microbiological risk of contamination. But you compare that to a prescription drug or a medical device, right? Where if you have a failure of that product or some contamination, you can have a serious adverse health event, right? A serious consequence with respect to somebody's health, either because it fails, like it doesn't work, or because it works in a way that the doctor wasn't expecting, or there's some compliance problem in the manufacture of the product. So those FDA's regulatory construct is going to be based mostly on risk. For food companies, ordinarily, you have to worry about things like labeling. This is true for cosmetics and foods. Labeling issues, registration issues, making certain you're declaring what is in the product, making certain the consumer understands what the product is and that it's safe. It's been made in a way that's not unsafe. For drugs, for medical devices, biological products, they're going to be often pre-market approvals. You have to actually submit information to the government before you import into the United States. So the differences really have to do with risk.
Okay. And I was reading on your information the labeling and the inspection of the labels. And that was very interesting to learn about that.
When you have a labeling problem with a product, the law calls it misbranding, right? So it sounds like a crime, right? So when you misbrand something, then you've got something wrong with the label. And in most labeling situations, you have sort of three categories. You have misbranding, you have three categories. You have certain things that you're obligated to say, right? This is mandatory information that has to be on the label. Things like what it is, right? The statement of identity. And that's true for an over-the-counter drug, a cosmetic, a food, a dietary supplement, a beverage, it doesn't matter. What is it, right? That's required. Net quantity statement, mandatory. Ingredient statements, mandatory. So those are mandatory requirements. If you don't have that, then the product is misbranded if you're missing anything. The other way to think of it is things that you're not allowed to say, right? There's certain things you cannot say on the label depending upon what the product is, because if you do, you change the way the government regulates the product. And a good example would be a cosmetic product that claims not only to perform some cosmetic function, beautifying, changing the appearance, but also affecting the structure or the function of the body, right? If the cosmetic is designed to do something that's more than what a cosmetic should do, then it could be a drug, it could be regulated as a different product. Mm-hmm. Or making a statement like FDA approved on a product that FDA doesn't approve. So that's an example of saying something that you're not supposed to say, or you're not allowed to say. There's different kinds of claims that the government just will not allow. And then the other kinds of misbranding charges have mostly to do with some factor that's not related to the label itself, but Congress had to figure out how to charge it, so they call it misbranding. And a good example is registration, right? If I manufacture a product that requires FDA requires me to register my facility, and I don't register my facility, but I sell my product is misbranded, right? Mm-hmm. Even though the labeling is fine. It's just the statute just deems it to be misbranded. And the interesting thing here is at the border, if you think about it, the easiest violation for the government to find is a labeling violation, because it's right in front of them, right? It's literally in front of them. So they're looking at the bottle, they're looking at the package, and they can see the mistake. They don't have to test it. They don't have to sample it. They don't have to open the package. They don't do anything. They can just charge it right away because it's misbranded. So it's amazing how many times, the government will charge a misbranding violation, and then you start dealing with the agency to fix that. Then they start asking you questions about the product itself, right? So you start getting into this dialogue that goes sort of down into a rabbit hole, and you can find yourself taking weeks or so to get a shipment released based upon a simple mistake on the label.
Yeah, that was very interesting to read about, that labeling plays that important role. With the change in administration on its way, we will have a lot to talk about in the coming year. So what trends have you seen recently in FDA and customs enforcement activity affecting your clients, and what about the future?
Yeah, I'm glad you brought it up. So I decided to start this podcast in part because I felt it was important for industry and companies that want to come into the U.S. market, or even have problems on a regular basis with the FDA, to have a place to go get information about how this works at the border, right, and what they can do. But of course, the election recently also sort of begs the question as to, well, what's going to happen? And so I feel like we'll sort of probably do some back and forth between the regular compliance stuff and then some of these policy things. I would say that the Food and Drug Administration, first of all, I've worked around or in the FDA for a very long time. I mean, since 1986, right? So think about that. I came into the government. I've been through a lot of administrations, right? I've been through all sorts of Democrat administrations, Republican administrations, and then on the outside, I've interacted with the government through these various administrations. And you can see the pendulum swing depending upon who's in office, one direction or another in these highly regulated spaces. You know, the Food and Drug Administration regulates about 40% of the GDP, which is massive, right? It's an incredibly large agency. In the last couple of years, certainly the last 2 years, the FDA and Customs have both become very, very strict in some respects, and in other respects, very sort of distant. They've been trying to find ways that people who make the decisions are trying to find ways to not be known who they are, right? They sort of hide behind the frontline compliance officer, and the compliance officers don't seem to have the authority to make the decision, and they're referring things to headquarters, and then the decision sort of comes months later because it's taking so long. So that's been one trend I've seen over the last probably 2 years, which has gotten very bad in the last 6 months. A lot of times it's taking months and months for the government to get back to you on an issue, which before they would have been able to handle in a week or two. So I think that's one main problem that we're seeing. Going forward, there's a lot of people I think that are concerned in the government about how the next administration is going to handle. FDA is, of course, a part of HHS. So Robert F. Kennedy Jr. is being nominated as the secretary of HHS, and he's not a traditional HHS secretary in many respects. And so there's concern that that's going to affect how the government's going to regulate foods and cosmetics and pharmaceuticals, et cetera. And I think on a large scale, that's true. But on the smaller scale, the day-by-day compliance people are just going to do what's in the current statute. You're not going to see a lot of change in terms of interaction with the Food and Drug Administration. With Customs, I do think we'll see increased tariffs. I think that's obvious. You'll see more tariffs coming for products that are being imported from China. There's I think a reasonable threat of that being true for products coming from Mexico. And that means FDA-regulated goods as well. The majority of what we consume in this country that's FDA-regulated is not made here. It's made in other countries. It's imported into the country, either raw materials, major raw materials, for finishing, or the finished goods are coming from other countries all over the world. 182 plus countries are shipping products here. So the trade issues actually affect the FDA regulated goods as well. And that's just sort of a high level look at it right now. And we'll see sort of where it goes over the next weeks. And I'll do what I can to try to bring up things as I see them in the podcast to come.
Well, that's crazy. And sounds like you are very acclimated with the change. So,
I'm not sure you can be acclimated. I certainly recognize it when it happens, right? And so if that's the key. If you can't figure out what's happening, then you can't figure out how to adjust. And I've been around long enough to be able to see, to see where it's going. So that the hope is to be able to adjust for my clients' benefit.
Well, that's good. Yes, that's very good for your clients, having that experience behind you. Well, for small businesses, for the smaller businesses or startups that may not have a dedicated compliance teams, what are the most important steps they can take to stay on top of FDA and customs compliance for imports?
Yeah, and this is not even just for imports. I mean, it's really just generally. I mean, the import compliance piece of it is just the intersection when the goods are crossing the border, right? Yep. The FDA compliance piece applies sort of no matter whether it's made here or made someplace else. The manufacturing compliance components relate to wherever the manufacturer is. The labeling, wherever that product is being distributed in the United States. And so it just so happens, if I make something, let's say I make something here in Maryland, I'm in Annapolis right now, and I make something here in Annapolis and I ship it down to you and you're in Tampa. There's no customs agent, there's no FDA agent at the border at Maryland and Virginia, right? Or Virginia and North Carolina. Like there's nobody stopping to check things before they come into the next state. Right. It just goes to the next state. Now, if I make that same product and I make it in the Dominican Republic and I'm going to ship it to you in Tampa, there's a customs officer, there's a number of FDA people, USDA, DEA, EPA, you name it, commerce, everybody's at the border. And so it's exactly the same product, but it's under a stricter level of review, right? There's a greater opportunity for interaction with the government, which means that importers, people who are in the import space, need to understand the requirements and make certain they can document that they're complying with those requirements in ways that ordinarily a domestic company would only have that issue arise when they were actually physically inspected, like the government coming to your facility and inspecting. Otherwise, the government's not around in the domestic market, right? They're not even really present. So the big thing is you got to understand how the government regulates the product. What is the thing? Right? Is it really a dietary supplement or is it a drug? Is it a homeopathic over-the-counter drug? Is it a cosmetic or is it a drug? Is it a food? Is it a beverage? Does it require, are the risks associated with the product the kinds of risks that could be, microbiological, right? Salmonella, contamination, or maybe chemical, like pesticides, right? So understanding what it is, the kinds of risks associated with the product, and then finding in the actual FDA regulations, the provisions, the regulations that actually govern that product, and read them, right? It's amazing how many people, they try to operate off of what they read on the internet, whether it's an FDA guidance document or it's somebody writing an article or whatever. Just read the regulations. It's amazing what you can learn when you read the regulations. And then you learn the language of the regulations. And when you do your searches on the internet at FDA.gov or customs.cbp.gov, you can use the language that's in the reg. And then you actually get the documents related to the reg rather than anything, right? You could be anything. So I would say that. And the other thing I would say is first, most companies are small businesses that are in the FDA regulated space. I mean, they're technically classified as small business. They have less than 100, sometimes definitely less than 50, less than 25 employees. So those are small businesses. And so it'd be rare for them to have somebody who's dedicated to only doing regulatory compliance. So the other thing I would tell you to do is reach out and find somebody that you can just talk to when you need to. You don't have to have a long-term, like a big project with an attorney like me or a consultant. You can just have somebody that's available. And a lot of times I can answer questions in 20, 30 minutes that will help you, save you days and days and days and weeks of headache. So I would say, read the regs, make sure you understand what your product is, and then be willing to ask for help.
Absolutely. A lot of red tape to go through. So unless you have somebody who is dedicated and knows it, you're a good source.
Yeah, indeed.
You've been listening to FDA Imports with Benjamin England. And Benjamin, if somebody would like to get in touch with you, what's the best way to do so?
Well, first of all, if you can't find me, you're not looking. All right. FDAImports.com is a footprint that's been around for over 18 years. If you just go to the internet and look up FDAImports.com, you'll find the consulting practice. That's probably the fastest way. If you want to reach out to me, I would encourage you to reach out to me through email. And that would be contact@FDAImports.com. And that's FDA Imports with an S, plural.com. And that's the name of the company, FDAImports.com LLC. And you'll be able to talk to myself and my staff. And any questions, you can do it right through the website, or you can email us any questions. We'll be happy to get back to you.
Well, there you go. Well, thank you. We appreciate your time today.
Thanks very much. Good to see you.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to hit that like and subscribe button and leave us a review in the comments.